James Carter sat at his kitchen table, the kind that had witnessed more bills than breakfasts. And let me tell you, this morning wasn't shaping up to be any different. The sunlight crept through the blinds, slow and reluctant, casting long shadows over a pile of paperwork that seemed less like documents and more like a monument to frustration. At 42, James was supposed to be one of those men who had made it. You know the type, the ones who walk into a room and everyone straightens up, not because they want to, but because they have no choice. But life, oh life, it doesn't care about your plans, your titles, or how hard you've worked. It's got this nasty habit of throwing bricks in your face just when you think you've got it all figured out. James stared at that stack of papers, each one mocking him with its fine print and bureaucratic nonsense. It wasn't that he couldn't understand it. He probably could recite the contents of a financial statement in his sleep. But today? Today it all felt heavier, more personal. Maybe it was the stress of running a massive company. Maybe it was the nagging thought that no matter how high he climbed, the world always had a way of reminding him where he came from. And where was that, you ask? Southside Chicago, baby. The kind of place where dreams either grow teeth or get eaten alive. James wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Hell, there wasn't even a plastic one. His father worked double shifts at a steel mill until the day he was fired for speaking up about unsafe working conditions. "You've got to be 10 times better than them," his father used to say. Those words seared into James's brain like a brand. Not twice, 10 times, because they'll never let you forget who you are. James took that advice to heart. He clawed his way out of that neighborhood through scholarships, internships, and endless late nights. He built himself into a man people couldn't ignore. And yet here he was, 20 years later, staring at a stack of papers, like some cruel reminder that no matter how far you go, the world always finds a way to drag you back down. But James wasn't about to let that happen. Not today. He had a plan. You see, James had this little habit. Every now and then, he liked to go undercover. No suits, no ties, no chauffeur waiting in the car. Just James, in a beat-up leather jacket and jeans that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. It was his way of staying grounded, seeing the world the way most people did, unvarnished, raw. And today he decided to visit one of the branches of his own bank, not for a big meeting, not to shake hands and make speeches, but just to see how things really ran when no one knew who he was. He'd chosen a branch downtown, the kind of place that looked polished on the outside but had a reputation for treating its customers unfairly. James had heard whispers, complaints about long wait times, dismissive staff, and in more than one case, outright discrimination. He couldn't ignore it. He grabbed his wallet, his keys, and a baseball cap that had seen better days and headed out the door. He wasn't expecting much, maybe a few raised eyebrows, a little impatience from the staff, but what he walked into, that was a whole different story. When James stepped into the bank, the air hit him like a wall. You know that feeling, the one where you walk into a room and suddenly everyone pretends you don't exist? Yeah, it was that. The space was sleek, marble floors, shiny counters, but it felt colder than a morgue. A few customers scattered around, waiting in line or filling out forms. The staff, mostly white, barely glanced up as he entered. James made his way to the counter, keeping his head low. He wasn't there to cause a scene, just to observe. The guy behind the counter, mid-30s, with a face that screamed, "I peaked in high school," gave him a once-over that lasted just a little too long. His name tag read Mike, and James could already tell he was going to be a problem. "Can I help you?" Mike asked in a tone that clearly screamed, "I don't want to." "Yes," James replied evenly. "I'd like to withdraw $5,000 from my account." Mike raised an eyebrow, leaning back slightly like James had just asked to borrow his car. "Do you have ID?" James pulled out his wallet and handed over his driver's license, along with his bank card. Mike took them with deliberate slowness, making James's teeth clench. "What's the account number?" Mike asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. James gave it to him. Mike typed it into the computer, his fingers moving like molasses. After what felt like an eternity, he frowned. "Yeah, we can't do that," Mike said, sliding the cards back across the counter. James blinked. "Excuse me. We don't have that kind of cash on hand," Mike said, shrugging. "You'd need to put in a request, and even then we'd have to verify certain things." "Certain things," James repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "Like what?" Mike smirked, the kind of smirk that made you want to punch him in the teeth. "Like whether the funds are legitimate." For a moment, James just stared at him, the words hanging in the air like a bad smell. Legitimate. That one word hit him harder than any insult ever could. He felt the weight of every barrier he'd ever had to break through, every indignity he'd swallowed just to get here, and here he was again, being treated like a criminal for daring to exist. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to let this guy see how much he'd gotten under his skin. Not yet. "Well," James said, leaning slightly closer to the counter, "how about you check again?" Mike sighed dramatically, as if James were asking him to perform brain surgery. "Look, sir," he said, dragging out the last word like an insult. "Even if we had the cash, which we don't, you'd need to provide additional documentation, to prove you're not. James's jaw tightened. "No," he said slowly. "I don't know. Why don't you explain it to me?" Mike hesitated, but just for a second. Then he leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let's just say we have policies," he said. "Got to make sure everything checks out. You understand." James understood perfectly, and in that moment he made a decision. This wasn't going to end here. James stood there, his patience hanging by a thread thinner than the smirk on Mike's face. The guy had the kind of attitude that made you wonder how he hadn't been punched yet. Mike's last remark, laced with thinly veiled suspicion, echoed in James's head. "We have policies. You understand." Yeah, James understood all right. Understood that I'm about to lose my cool. "I asked for my money, not an interrogation," James said, his tone now sharper. A few customers glanced over, sensing the shift, but Mike? Oh no, he wasn't done. The guy leaned back in his chair, folding his arms like he was about to deliver a lecture. "Look," Mike began, his voice dripping with fake patience. "It's not personal. We just need to make sure everything checks out. Some people, they try to game the system." James let that hang in the air for a moment. His jaw clenched. The rage bubbling inside him wasn't new. It was the same anger he'd carried since the South Side, the kind that came from being constantly underestimated. And now, here he was again, being treated like he didn't belong, realizing he'd stepped into dangerous territory. But instead of apologizing, he doubled down. James's mind raced as he stood there, feeling the cold marble underfoot and the weight of the moment. He could almost hear his father's voice, the one that had echoed through his life since he was a kid on the South Side. "You've got to be 10 times better than them." And today he was 10 times better. He didn't need to be the kind of person who made a scene for the sake of it. But when someone like Mike, someone who had clearly forgotten what it meant to respect people, decided to test him, it became something more. It wasn't just about a bad customer service experience. It was about standing up, about reminding everyone in that room exactly who they were dealing with. James wasn't some forgotten name on a list, or some faceless customer lost in the shuffle. He wasn't the man they could casually look down on because of where he came from or what he looked like. He wasn't about to let anyone make him feel small again. As David returned with the documents, James knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. This was about shaking up a system that had long been broken. He wasn't going to stop here. His reputation, his power, his very presence, wasn't something anyone could ignore for long. David returned, clutching the handbook and the complaint logs, but there was a nervous energy in his steps. He knew James wasn't just some high-profile customer. He was someone who had just been handed the keys to the castle. David handed the documents over, his fingers slightly trembling. James didn't even glance at them immediately. Instead, he met David's gaze, locking eyes with a kind of calm intensity that left no room for doubt. "Let's make sure this never happens again," James said quietly. And for the first time that day, the bank seemed to breathe again. It was the quiet after the storm. As he turned to leave, James's thoughts lingered on the faces of the people in the bank. The customers, the employees, all of them now knew one thing for certain. James Carter was not someone they could afford to mess with. "I know what you're all thinking," James said, his voice carrying so everyone could hear. "Who is this guy? Why is he making such a big deal over a withdrawal?" A few soft chuckles rippled through the crowd. James allowed a smirk to spread across his face, pausing just long enough to build the tension. "Let me answer that for you," he continued, leaning in a little. "I'm James Carter, and I don't just bank here. I own this entire damn place." The room exploded. Gasps, whispers, even a few laughs filled the space. One older man muttered, "Well, I'll be damned," while a young woman pulled out her phone, already recording the moment. James let the shock wash over him, waiting for the noise to settle before speaking again. "This isn't about the money," he said, his voice now taking on a serious tone. "This is about respect. About making sure that every single person who walks through these doors is treated fairly. Because I'm not just the CEO of this bank. I'm someone who's been where you are. Someone who's been told no too many times just because of how I look." The room went quiet again, everyone hanging on his every word. Even the employees who had been trying to stay out of sight were now staring, wide-eyed. "This branch," James said, gesturing around the room, "has been failing its customers. Not just today, but for months, maybe years. And that stops now." At that moment, David reappeared, holding a thick binder and a stack of papers. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice quivering slightly, "here's the handbook and the logs you requested." James took the documents without even looking at them and turned back to the crowd. "You see this?" he asked, holding up the binder. "This is supposed to be the rule book. But rules don't mean a thing if the people enforcing them are broken." A clapping sound came from the back, quickly followed by the rest of the room joining in applause. James raised a hand to quiet them. "Now here's what's going to happen," he said, turning back to David. "You're going to audit this branch top to bottom. Every employee, every policy, every transaction. And you're going to report directly to me. Understood?" "Yes, sir," David murmured, barely above a whisper. "And as for Mike," James continued, his voice turning colder, "he's fired. Effective immediately." David nodded, but James wasn't finished. He turned back to the customers, his voice rising again. "If any of you have ever been mistreated at this branch, or any other branch of this bank, I want to hear about it today. And I promise you, it will be handled." A middle-aged woman near the front stepped forward, her voice quivering. "Thank you," she said. "You don't know how much this means to us." James gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I do," he replied simply. As the crowd began to disperse, James made his way to the door. He paused and turned back to the stunned employees.